Woo! All right, it is Wednesday, December 7th. It is almost Christmas time. It is a beautiful day in Austin, Texas. I know it's really cold up north, but we have great weather. It's actually going to be 80 degrees today, I think. Kind of crazy when you think about it. Yeah, it is 80 degrees right now. We have a great guest. Before we get rolling here, let's listen from our own John Sibley Butler.
Louis Allen, it's so good to see you. You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. When the road is rough, up above, and you're miles and miles from your real nice bed. Just remember what your old pal said. You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me.
Woo!
Bravo! Bravo!
Very nice.
That was for Louis.
John Butler, how are you, sir?
I am doing fine. Just looking at everything go by, looking at the virus come back. I'm looking at the whole idea of the relationship between distributed work and where people are. I just left a board meeting and it's hard to hire people. People do not want to be in a physical place in an office. So I think that's very, very interesting. But on the other hand, my hometown here in Austin, Texas is absolutely booming. The tallest building in the great state of Texas is going up, and the world is pretty wild. We look at what's going again overseas, and looking at the absolute bombing that people are doing in Europe, and then on the other hand, I watched a great golf match from that tour, the old European tour, and you know it's pretty wild as Christmas comes in and the holidays come in, then there's almost a calmness about things. With everything that's going on, from the political stuff to the war to the inflation, it's like it's all happening simultaneously. Like almost a perfect storm of something, but I don't know what it is. But you talk to people, and people are very sure about the future if they have an occupation. They're very unsure if they don't.
Yeah.
Of course, people are laying people off. So it's a little different in that when you put in the war and you put in the disease or the COVID, then it's a little different. So analyzing it becomes very, very complicated, but it's an interesting time to be around.
Yeah, absolutely. Llewellyn King, how are you, sir?
I'm very well. I just got back this morning. I landed briefly in Houston on my way back from Chile, flew overnight, had to go because of living in Rhode Island and the very few direct flights. And we just got into the house about 20 minutes ago. So here I am.
How was Chile? How was Chile?
I wasn't in Chile very long. But I like Chile, but particularly I enjoyed Peru. A little more time in Peru, and I just enjoy South America generally. I say that, Johnny, not to ingratiate myself with you in native South American masquerading as a Texan. Well, that's all right. I see the Louisianan there also masquerades as a Texan. Are there any actual native Texans at all? Or are you all people in some kind of joint witness protection program?
No, we create them. We're not in them, but we create them.
Anyway, it was a great trip. I wanted to see the Suez Canal. I wanted to see the Panama Canal. I've not seen it. And I wanted to see the engineering. I wanted to see it for 50, 60 years. I wanted to see it. And so we took a cruise through it, and it was fantastic.
That's wonderful.
When we come to look at the world, it's not so promising. One of the things we do routinely on this program is discuss electricity. And one of the follies that I have espoused, did you hear that, Johnny? One of the follies I have espoused from time to time is the wonderful thing about electricity is nobody has made a weapon of it. That's before Putin started bombing people into the dark. In medieval times, I just wrote this, it'll be in my newspaper column hopefully this week, but in medieval times, an aggressor poisoned the wells and people were killed and driven out of their fortresses and their homes and their countries because the water supply was poisoned, usually by putting a rotten animal down the well, or sometimes a more reliable lethal poison. Now we have the new equivalent of that. You cut off the electricity at the start of winter. And as modern societies run entirely on electricity, civilized life stops, people are freezing in the dark. It is an especial cruelty in war because it's directed at the civilian population, not at the military population. So you have a situation where Russia is not doing well on the ground, so it's gone to this more dreadful, more obnoxious, crueler way of trying to get its victory in Ukraine. It's a very sad and terrible thing. And the thing about electricity is you don't fix it overnight. I mean, we just saw what happened with the shooting up of a substation in North Carolina. Well, my God, when you take out viciously large chunks of a grid, it takes months. And that assumes you have the spares. And of course, so much of an electric grid is bespoke. Mass electric goods are bespoke. They're made for specific jobs, particularly transformers, a shortage of them. Most of them are made in China. But if you destroy the transformers in the Ukraine system, they won't be replaced in a long time. And you can't do a Berlin airlift. You can't fly in electricity. So it's a very grim situation in Ukraine. And unfortunately, it may force them into an unsatisfactory peace with the Russians, which I'm sure is the objective there.
Well, maybe, Llewellyn, that make batteries much more powerful. Maybe we need
that's true, but
we transfer. Talk to Dan about providing batteries.
Johnny, you're going to need a great breakthrough in battery technology to be able to back up an entire grid.
Well, we got one of the,
when we talk about batteries, we're talking about little tiny bits of the grid.
We got the right guest for this. We got the right guest for this.
Is it Andres?
Well, we got the right guest for this. Dan Gregory spent most of his life doing grid stuff. And Dan, how are you, sir?
I'm fabulous. How are you, Andres?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being with us today. Dan is the CEO of Available Power. He's going to be with us for about another 50 minutes or so. And prior to Available Power, Dan was the CEO of AP Cyber, which means that he also knows a lot about cybersecurity. And he was the head of microgrid solutions at Shell Energy, New Energies, a division of Shell, the big Royal Shell company. He also was the founder and CEO of Post-N, and don't know what that is, but love to hear more about it. He is a special advisor for electricity at the government of Haiti, the Ministry of Energy Security, and he was chairman of the Industry Advisory Board at Freedom Systems Center and NSF Gen 3 Research Center. And he kind of started his career at Arriva TND, even though I'm sure he sold newspaper and other things when he was young. But welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks. Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us what Available Power does and maybe chime into the whole, can batteries save the grid?
Well, fair enough. So Available Power is a project development company focused on energy. We do large scale, grid scale work. So a traditional developer, we bring financing and we wrap up projects to get them built. And so, we're very active, very exciting times for us. And we think we could have some real impact, especially in the area of batteries, but there's some other things too. So I think that's, that's the crux of it. I'd like to say my view coming today is, and I think the right topic is hardening the grid, right? Because
Mhm.
batteries save the grid, no, that's not,
Mhm.
that's not realistic. But can batteries help harden the grid? Yes, absolutely. And to me, that word harden the grid, has a lot of meaning to it. That
Sure.
phrase has a lot of meaning to it. So to me, that's where we can use them very effectively. We can also do other things, arbitrage, and we can load levelize and shift and things like that for optimization to make the economics work.
Mhm.
The big message that I want to bring today is, even without any new breakthroughs in battery technology, we're making the economics work, right? So
Mhm.
that's the big moment when transitions occur. When you can
Mhm.
start justifying, without playing a bunch of games and playing with figures, legitimately justify the investment with a return to your investors, you can make things happen. Until you
Right.
get to that point, you do a lot of R&D, a lot of pilots. I've done a lot of that. But now we're ready to affect the transition once the economics make sense.
Right.
So that's where we're at today. It's pretty exciting.
But
So
Dan-
tell us, so hold
Oh,
on, tell us real quick, Dan, about your project with ERCOT and what are you trying to achieve there?
Well, I got to say, it's my favorite project. I've thought about what's the most fun thing I've done, the one that had potentially the most impact. And it's this one. It's the ERCOT 100 project, we call it. We've selected, it's now more than 100 sites, 120 as of today, where we've filed for interconnection agreements into ERCOT to build distribution scale batteries connected at the grid. So, these are not huge things. These are under 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt hour batteries distributed all over Texas. But the beauty of it is they're easy to connect. The interconnection process is fairly straightforward. We've been at this for a few years. We're a little bit ahead of the market, fortunately. So our interconnections are pretty far along. It puts us in a good position to really start executing on projects coming into Q1, and that's what we'll be doing. So at this point, we have, I think it's last count, 62 of the 120 interconnections have made it through the first screening and are in various stages of completion.
Mhm.
So, that's a big part of developing these projects, is getting the approval to connect them to the grid. That's really the biggest part. Everything else
Right.
can be managed with normal engineering, normal EPC functions, but the interconnection is really the key. And, we've been fortunate enough to find ourselves in Texas, where our services are needed and where we can really help. And the utilities are being fantastic. So,
Right.
it's where
Well,
we are today.
Well, Dan, very, very interesting. We've also talked a lot about the grid here. We've talked about the technology, the old technology of the grid. We've talked about from the grid edge into the homes. We've talked about having the big wires going, and then you have distribution centers, and then it goes to the home. Do you see any, and by the way, we think that the boxes should be smart boxes. As you hook up to the grid and realize that you're hooking up to a 1929 technology, and I think your technology is probably much smarter than what you're hooking up to in terms of how it communicates with each other and et cetera. How do you view hooking up to a grid that certainly has been around and done a good thing, but the technology itself is not automated completely? It certainly could be much better for you if it were automated. So how do you view just hooking up to the grid and the general process of the grid today? Not the necessarily hardening of the grid, but where it is today in terms of technology.
Well, that's a fabulous insight and question there. I love that question. It's near and dear to my heart. One of my good friends and partners in my business, Dr. Alex Wong, is over at UT Austin. He's pretty legendary, even though he would never admit that, in power electronics. and being the, one of the key inventors of the silicon carbide switching device and being instrumental in coming up with ways to commercialize gallium nitride for high power switching. Really technical, really deep stuff from one of the most brilliant people I ever met, probably ever will meet. It's power electronics that enable all this. So when we look at how do we connect to 1929 technology, one of the things I did very early in my career, I worked with EPRI for about 5 years on utility communications architecture, became IEC 61850. I was on that team as a kid. I did a lot of field work and so forth. And one of the things I wanted to do is learn what the heck Edison was thinking, because they sent me out to Keyport substation in New Jersey. And they said, hey, we want you to make this a switchless substation. It's a little distribution substation, not critical to anybody. So I walk in the substation, not making this up. Some of the equipment was signed by Thomas Edison himself. And so I looked at this, the relays were and things like this. I looked at this and I said, oh my goodness, what an opportunity, right? Now, keep in mind, I'm like 25 years old, and I walked in and had the keys to the kingdom. I could go in and just try to make this substation switchless. In the end, we did it. It wasn't pretty. It was very highly custom. I wouldn't say it was scalable. It was an R&D EPRI project, but it really yielded some very interesting results. And what it taught us is that Thomas Edison recognized the issues that we're still grappling with today on the transmission and distribution system and power generation in general. We all know about the AC-DC wars between Tesla and Edison and all that. We don't need to really address that. But the interesting thing is I said, something's going on here in this person's head when he designed all this. So I read all his patents. And if you're interested, you can go online and read them. It's about 1,100 of them. I happen to also be an audiophile for fun my whole life. And he wrote a lot of stuff on audio as well. So I read them all, and it let me get inside his head a bit. And it also showed me that he understood the limitations of the tools he had at the time. It didn't mean that he didn't understand the challenge, he just didn't have a way to deal with it. What was he missing? He was missing the ability to switch reliably at very high current in DC. So it was creating arcs, could potentially create fires. There was a couple of those. It really derailed his approach because he didn't have a way to manage the system and optimize the system that was safe enough. And I think that was fundamentally the biggest issue he fought. He didn't deny that, like the movies tend to show, the popular movies and all those things. He was just trying to figure it out. And he simply didn't have some of the innovations, like, in my opinion, Dr. Wong should be just as important in history. Probably won't be as famous, but to me, he is. But, these people that came along now, the next generation, and obviously there's many, have enabled something to happen here that I believe Thomas Edison wanted to do. So that's the key thing here. It's not like we're going in and redesigning a bad design. We're finishing and not even finishing, but improving on a design that was fundamentally brilliant and almost freakishly brilliant for the time. And so when I look at what Tesla did, the man, and I look at what Thomas Edison did, I admire them, of course, we all admire them and all that. We also have to recognize they were struggling to figure out how to make all this come together. We never really got past that stage. And so what I'm suggesting is to connect to this old system, this 1929 technology, you could argue 1890s technology. It's really not a problem at all once you have that unlock, which is the ability to manage high current, high power quickly and efficiently with digital technology. Right. And that's been enabled by people like Dr. Wong and the power electronics programs that are out there and driving the world forward. It's just thrilling, in my opinion. It's enabled things like those patents and those ideas have enabled things like LED lighting, like your little flat screen, thin flat screen, huge TVs. All this stuff happened. But what's more exciting from an energy and grid standpoint is that same technology translates to motors, pumps, loads, arc furnaces. It all matters. And we can now address things that we just simply couldn't deal with before. So as a result, I'm not really worried about the grid. I think it's the other way. The grid's very exciting. It's an amazing tool we have around the world, especially in the United States. We have a very advanced honestly fabulous and complex grid that's really well understood. We're covering vastly long lines, much more so than most other countries in the world. Europe's very short lines, much easier to deal with. So we have a lot of challenges we've overcome here. Phasure measurement units, advanced metering, all these things have really improved the existing grid and prepared it for the next step.
Yes,
So the
well,
next
Alex,
step, in my view, is the batteries.
yeah, Alex is a dear friend, and let me ask you this: we think that everything is available on the shelf to make the grid where computers are today. So if we use the historic analogy, we like to say that, well, you know, the grid is where computers were 60 years ago. Until somebody came in like a Microsoft and standardized everything, and we knew where everything was. Of course, there's a risk of getting hacked. Do you think that the technology exists sitting on the shelf, and the general idea is that it sits on the shelf, and then and people just ask for additional research and nothing happens to all of the new technologies that we have? Do you think then that everything is sitting on the shelf to completely bring up the grid to a digital kind of machine like the computer? If we say that the grid is where computers were in terms of standardization, knowing where every piece of electricity is, and et cetera. I think that technology exists on the shelves today. Are you in agreement with that, or do you disagree with that?
Oh, I definitely agree with that. As a developer, you know, our job is not to develop new technology. I've done a lot of that in my life, but yeah, we're so excited because we can make the economics work. Why can we make the economics work? Because the equipment's in production. We don't have to invent anything. We got to piece it together. We got to integrate it. We got to be smart about the fundamental engineering, but we do not have to invent some big gap that's missing anymore. There is some pieces to improve for sure, and there always will be. This is the world's most complex machine, the grids are, and you know, the fact that it's synchronized and governed by frequency makes it very reliable. We don't want to interrupt that. I think it's very important to understand when we go digital, we're talking about enabling technologies, but in the end, we are dealing with a mechanical system, and we're dealing with physics, and everything is governed by frequency, and it's beautifully done. And so we don't want to disrupt that in any way by, you know, assuming that we can build the equivalent of a digital internet with the grids. I think we can leverage all these technologies to further optimize the grid and ultimately make it, quote, self-healing. You know, a lot of the work has been done early on with EPRI, Duke Energy, Southern Cal Energy, PG&E back then. Those utilities were really pushing on self-healing grids on a distribution level. And they've done a lot of work since. Baltimore Gas and Electric with Volt VAR control started that in, I believe, the early 80s with programmable logic controllers. So a lot of this has been worked on for a long time. It's just getting, the key here is it's not that it's so difficult to understand anymore. It's that it was too expensive, too complex, too expensive. That problem is now overcome. Now we can start affording to do this. We have the tools necessary so that we can enable the transition to take place. And I think this is the pivot point at this moment. I don't think it could have been done even 2 years ago.
Dan, if I understood you, you said that the time has arrived when the economics for batteries are correct. I wondered, where do they fit economically? Are they sold as a defense and as a defensive mechanism, or as a productive mechanism? Which side of that equation would they, of that ledger, would they be on? Do you expect utilities or whatever the entity is to buy them as a form of defense or something else, or as part of a live system? For example, if operating in conjunction with a wind farm, then they would be not a defense, but part of a live system. If they're waiting for the grid to go down, then they're a defensive mechanism.
It's a fabulous question, Llewellyn, and
Did you
look,
hear that, Johnny?
we can't sell anything in this industry, in my opinion, will not be adopted selling insurance. You know, insurance sells, that's its own market. Dealing with defense and dealing with insurance is a different approach to the world, and I don't claim to understand it. We need to recognize it. There may be a play there in the long term for those kind of mechanisms to justify these systems, but that's not our approach. Our approach is real-time, dynamic optimization and stabilization and hardening of the grid, purely based on the economics, the savings that can be achieved by using these batteries properly in the normal operations of the electric grids.
If I can follow up, I like the idea that there are no simple answers to complex questions unless the question gets so complex that only a simple solution will work. And as a rather crude example of that, if you have terrible teeth, at some point, false teeth may be the simple solution to a complex problem. Do you see any, where the grid gets very complex? It is very complex. And I don't subscribe actually to what Johnny sometimes says, that it's a 1929 structure. It's actually very dynamic, alive, and contemporary structure, in my view. And I think part of its genius is that it can have a strange wonky pole with a bundle of wires on the top, and at the other end it can have some of the most advanced power electronics that can be dreamt up. But at some point in the hardening, do we have to just rethink the whole concept of how we deliver electricity? Because it would seem the great vulnerability is in the delivery, not in the generation. We can protect a generating source more easily than the delivery system, with many vulnerable points along it.
Well, boy, I love these questions. Thank you for that. It is a very complex grid, very complex question, but I do have a fairly simple answer that I can offer. There's nothing really simple about it, but it's a quick answer anyway. I need to do a little sidestep here. My friend Jiggershaw and I were commiserating about this topic about 2 years ago in Bethesda. You know, we're just sitting there in a pub talking about these issues and how can we really do something impactful that's really going to help without, because clearly we can't discard the transmission and distribution system or the critical assets that we've invested in. We economically can't afford it, and we shouldn't do that. It's miraculous equipment. It's an amazing design. How do we just modernize it, solve this problem as engineers? Engineers don't get very often to do a greenfield project, certainly not of the scale we're talking about. You have to live with what you got, and you have to work around that. And so when we look at this problem, my response that night, that's proven to be probably a pretty good response, is, hey, let's put battery energy storage systems. Okay, I want to use that word, systems. It's not just batteries, battery energy storage systems at the critical points in the grid, the congestion points, the critical loads. Let's start there. That's only 3 to 5% of the points in the grid. This is not trillions of dollars. This is billions of dollars, maybe even not 10, maybe $10 billion. This isn't ridiculous numbers. This is something that in today's world we can afford to do. Why would we do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One, we need to remove this congestion on the grid. We can start building more transmission lines, or we can ease up on the transmission system we have. And right now, what we're doing with the transmission system we have, in my view, is we're driving on the highway in third gear, going 70 miles an hour and redlining the whole system, because that's what we're stuck with right now. To calm that down, we can strategically locate significantly sized grid scale batteries. For example, one battery we're installing, right now we're developing a project that's in its final stages of approval in Austin with 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt hour battery. But it's not only that, it's highly reactive. So it's not just this long duration slow thing. This is a very reactive system. So I bring that up because now we can use that battery in that segment of the grid in a very effective way to relieve the pressure on that system. The utility has to do that. They got to decide how to do that. They make the rules with the interconnection agreement to do that. But in the end, that's what we have to do. So, you know, when it comes to basically stabilizing the grid, inserting these batteries in strategic points makes a lot of sense. And it really will ease up on the transmission system. So what does that mean? I mean, could we really do that? If we put batteries in 1,000 sites around the United States, I would make a very strong argument, and it could obviously be power system modeled and determined by universities such as Texas State and others. I would make the argument that we could stabilize the grid without adding more minimal amount of transmission. So I think that that's a very important way to look at this, is that what do we work with that's already there and how do we improve it and stabilize it? Batteries are great for that. Let's think about it. What I'm saying is now the transmission system's job is to charge the batteries, not follow the loads. So the only job is a very steady state load, keep that happy. And then that battery that's very fast and reactive, closer to the edge, can actually feed the loads and respond to them properly. It's a very exciting architecture without
If I could break
rewiring
in
very
and
much at all.
just make an editorial comment. I'm out of time. But that I so agree with you. I have been saying we're not going to build all these great east-west transmission lines. We're not going to build them. What we've got to do is to buttress the grid with shorter lines. And you've just explained a marvelous part of the dimension of buttressing the grid. Thank you.
Hey,
Let me
Dan,
just jump in here. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Andres.
hold on. Let me get back in here. Dan,
Okay.
I want you to help me with a couple scenarios real quick. One scenario is distributed generation, solar panels, you know, energy storage in the home. Every building becomes its own power plant. You can talk about your own solar installation in your new office. If you add the electric vehicle to that and manage the electric vehicles, right? So all of a sudden we have 22 million registered vehicles in Texas. They're all electric. Walk us through what does that do to the grid of the future, possibly? How does that help or hurt the grid? What could happen there?
Well, again, fabulous. I love this discussion because it's rare that I can get this kind of interaction going on with people and not have to explain basics, because clearly you're all up to speed and brilliant in this topic. So I think what's very exciting about electric vehicles and grid edge in general, however we handle loads at the edge, whether it's new forms of generation, fusion comes along. I'm a big fan for micro modular reactors. I think this is brilliant. These are not huge. These are small. They can't melt down. They're too small to melt down. Very exciting stuff is happening out there. And in the next 10 to 15 years, all those tools will come online one by one, and many more that we haven't even conceived yet. I believe that. And so as a result, we have to prep the grid to be able to be dynamic enough to allow that plug and play environment at the edge. And electric vehicles demand that use of their asset, right? So putting large batteries at feeders that feed the neighborhood grids, the feeders that come out into the homes and the neighborhoods, in the cities with this congestion and so forth, putting batteries in those locations safely behind the fence in cooperation and full support of the utility looks really smart to me. I don't think putting batteries in everybody's basement is smart. I think it's going to be regretted if we do it. I think there's a safety factor we can't ignore. And they're also complicated. I have one I built the cottage I'm sitting in here during the pandemic. I had to do something. So I built this, and I built a microgrid into it. It's all DC, and I had a blast with it. And I just built off the shelf parts. And frankly, I mostly use automotive parts from AutoZone to wire my electric system. And very inexpensive, about $2,700. I've got an off-grid system here. I'm talking to you on a microgrid right now with a podcast set up here and all that. All off solar and battery. I use grid as backup. I'm a big fan of the grid for backup. So I'm still connected, but not normally. So, you know, looking at all these things, yeah, it's fun. And guys like us can do that stuff. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is to let the utilities do what they do best with the staff they have. We've made a massive investment in this system, unprecedented investment in our electric system. Let's improve that. Let's invest there. let's let the folks in the neighborhoods, sure, there's always the guys that did Heathkits when they were kids like me, and they're going to do this stuff. That's not, in my opinion, realistic. That's not the right way to go. The right way to go is do it systematically, solve the big problem. Then when the cars plug in and start cooperating, how do we make all that work? Back to power electronics. When I talk about battery energy storage systems, I'm not only talking about batteries, I'm talking about capacitors. I'm talking about gallium nitride switching devices and high power silicon carbide switching devices. These systems are incredibly complex and capable. Let's leverage those to enable all this flexibility that Thomas Edison couldn't do. He wanted to do it. If you read the patents, you can feel it. And he just didn't have a way because everything was hardwired and he didn't have these innovations yet. But once you plug this together with power electronics, and then of course the final piece, they talk to each other, the systems actually interact.
Right.
Not only through power system frequency like today, where everything's synchronized on a frequency of 60 hertz in the United States, that works, that's physics, but actually can communicate with each other and say, hey, how are you doing? You need some power, or hey, I need some power. I'm simplifying, but that's the basic idea of this interoperable system that we set out to do when we set up UCA.
Yeah.
That started in May of 1989 at the Marriott Hotel in California, and you know, we went out there and we basically met with about 20 people after we set up the meeting, and we said, let's do utility communication architecture to enable interoperability. This is EPRI that thought of this. And I got asked to come and participate, and I was just blessed to be there. It was ridiculous that I got invited at such a young age. And I got to play with that for 5 years and really be a part of how that was laid out and did some field work. And I was more or less just a junior guy doing technician work and things like that. I learned a lot. And the way it all came together is, look, interoperability enables us to do things in this power system that we need to do. It's not only going to save us money, it's going to allow us to be more adaptive. And then of course, along comes AI and ML. So with advanced, you know, with artificial intelligence, machine language, machine learning, that combination makes it so that this system will get more and more adaptive if we put the tools in place to enable it. You can't do it just in software. This is not virtual. These are machines. It's real. And we need to actually give the interface to the software, physical interface to the software to enable it to do that. That's why I keep coming back to the power electronics.
Real quick, Dan, 2 more questions. How do we solve the problem of getting rid of the spinning machines with renewable energy and inertia? Is there a virtual inertia hope in front of us?
There is, you know, back to Dr. Wang and his work, as one example I know of very well. He drove the solid state transformer when we were at the Freedom Center. It won MIT's Innovation of the Year a few years ago. It connects, it enables connection at medium voltage with solid state equipment. And it allows us to do things like dial in frequency in real time, rather than being locked on 60 cycles. It allows us to accept AC and DC and put out AC and DC. So that all that new flexibility there is very realistic. And, you know, we need those tools. We need to start investing in those tools now so that we can enable this level of functionality as the cars come online in you know, they become normal and standard. You know, we definitely need to enable all that, and the right way to do it is start investing there, in my view.
Johnny.
Yeah, Dan, let me talk to you as just a citizen of America, the average Joe in America. And as Llewellyn would say, when he comes home, he just wants his lights to come on. He really doesn't care about all the technology. We're in a situation now where I think that everybody believes in America, if everyone purchased an electric car, they could just plug it in. I think that everybody believes in America that electricity is just electricity. It will always be there. Given that you're in a public-private kind of situation, and as I like to say on this program, before we had the great whiteout in Austin, I thought ERCOT was something that I put in a refrigerator I bought from HEB and bit into. But given that it's a public-private, and given that for the first time we thought we had the electric grid at the very, very center of the political process, it has since died down. How do you think about the funding in doing all this when the American people really don't think about the grid in terms of a machine, but it's just something to plug into, unless, as we said in the great state of Louisiana, I'm from Southern Louisiana, Mother and Dad, the power lines are down. I cannot watch television. So how do you get the consciousness, let's call it the grid consciousness, into the American people as we move toward electric cars, where you just can't go buy one and plug it in and think that you'll be fine? How can we get it into the political consciousness, into the consciousness of learning? Because every one of us who went through school never really thought about electricity. It was just something that we plugged something into and it worked.
Yeah, I agree. It's a real challenge. And for us to be effective today and actually get these projects built, we can't count on that support. We really can't. You know, we need to stay technical, keep our focus on execution, and we need to make sure our numbers stand on them on their own. So when we look at Texas, we all know we have a challenge there with the grids, you know, with the grid and specifically segments of the grid that we need to firm up. And it's not only for reliability and for that defense, as Llewellyn mentioned, that makes sense. That's a byproduct of it. We can't today really figure out how to monetize the value of that. I think it's tremendously valuable to people, but I don't think we have a mechanism that's clearly, easily counted on to go finance and execute these projects. So instead, we took the time to architect our solutions with a 200-page spec and a whole bunch of engineers involved. I've been fortunate to have been in this industry for 37 years, and this is all I've ever done. And we all kind of work together, make sure that we're not just dreaming or chasing windmills. You know, we're going to do something important here. And so we really focused on how do we make an elegant solution that saves money for Texas, that firms up the grid but pays for itself at the same time. And we've unlocked that. That's why we've got the capital we've got. That's why we have the major tier one vendors working with us. And we're going to roll out a big program. This ERCOT 100, I thought, was sort of the big enchilada. You know, this was like, let's go big. Let's think big. ERCOT 100, not ERCOT 10. Well, it turns out that's probably a pilot, the way this is going. This is very real. And the numbers are working. And the capital's all over us. They're all over us because the IRR is there. And keep in mind now, we're doing these projects on merchant. We're not contracting this power. We're not selling it wholesale. We're not pre-contracting it. We're developing these projects merchant. We went out to bid on our first round of projects. We got 52 institutions bidding on our projects to fund them. 52. We didn't use a broker. We didn't advertise. We did it ourselves. Without a broker, we got 52. So, you know, the numbers are there. We've been put through the mill. You know, we've been really ground through the ringer on this whole thing from a standpoint of literally hundreds of MBAs and very experienced finance folks tearing our models apart. And guess what? We ended up with a beautiful model as a result. So it took 3 years for us to get to this point, but we have an economic model that works and people are willing to invest at the merchant level. That means we don't have to wait to win some competitive bid process. We need to go build. We need to go execute as fast as we can. And that's what we're doing.
Dan, when you look at the need for telecommunications, is 5G the answer? Is it public networks? Is it private networks? Would you like to see a dedicated private infrastructure on communications for the grid? You know, when I was building the first smart grid in the world in Austin from 2003 to 2010, we had to build, you know, a standalone network. It was very painful with point-to-point Ethernet, and we deployed the first ADMS ever created in the world in partnership with GE, and it was just, the communication piece was critical. Without it, nothing would work.
Well, yes, 5G is great. 4G LTE is fine too, honestly. The issue is we need private networks. We can't do this through public backbone. We have to protect these assets. We got to segregate them from the public view. They can't be pinged. They can't be a part of the IP infrastructure. They need to be separate. Think back to the early days when I was doing substation automation. we leased a pair of telephone lines from AT&T for every substation we did, point to point,
Mhm.
dedicated lines, cost $1,000 a line. We put 2 in every substation. We had internet. It wasn't the internet, but we had networking,
Mhm.
corporate internal networking, TCP/IP
Mhm.
stuff, and we didn't use it. We weren't allowed to use it, but we wouldn't have considered it. Of course, times changed, economics changed. We decided to start using it. I think that was an error. I think we needed to keep these systems private. We should never use the public backbone. I think VPN is virtual. That means it's math. And I don't know about you guys, I'm pretty good at math, but there's always somebody smarter than me at math. So we're never going to win that battle. I really think we have to do this stuff physically private networks. That's my
Mhm. Yeah. Let me give you one scenario that I want to run by you. So a lot of the reasons we have all this investment by the government today is obviously because of the driver from the climate change. One simple way of solving the problem could be, instead of going distributed and impacting so many sites and dealing with the complexity of that, what if we just took half of Delaware? So Delaware is 1,900 square miles. If you take half of Delaware, 150 square miles, and you blanket it with solar panels, you could generate 1,100 gigawatts. So, we produce 1,100 gigawatts as a country today. Obviously, we would need that 3 times. So it's, roughly 2,500 gigawatts. We put some storage, roughly 2,200 gigawatts, so that we can have 24/7. The cost of that is roughly $2.3 trillion. And we can shut down all the coal plants and all the natural gas plants, including the nukes. Why aren't we doing that?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One, it's back to economics. We have stranded assets we can't afford to abandon. Some of them are pretty new and we can't just write them off. I think that's the reality of it. I mean, I realize what I'm saying is not popular, but we're stuck. We've built some stuff that we paid a lot of money for. Can't just turn them off and throw them away. We just can't afford it as a country. I think that's one piece to the answer. At least that's I'm not going political here. I don't know the politics of all that. I'm not a political guy. I'm just a technical guy. But to me, you got to always look at the numbers and say, can we afford this? When you're an engineer, you got to think in terms of, can we afford this? And the answer is, I don't think we can afford that. Now, having said that, I do think what you just described is very realistic and enabled by the power electronics I'm talking about. And that's where we need to go. And we need to get there as fast as we can, no doubt. But, when it comes to what we have for assets today, we have some pretty nice nuclear plants still available. And they're not our problem right now. We shouldn't worry about them. We got to maintain them, but they're an asset for us that we need to leverage for base load support. No question. The nukes play a role. Whether we build new ones or not, I'm a big fan, as I mentioned earlier, of small modular or even micro modular reactors. I think it's brilliant. I think it'd be done at the edge. It's safe. And it creates jobs, and it'll be a nice new manufacturing. I can imagine, making 100,000 MMRs out of a factory in Detroit 5 years from now. I believe it. And just to put some texture on that, Westinghouse is developing what they call a nuclear battery, but really it's a little MMR. And it's 5 megawatts electric, 15 megawatts thermal. It's beautiful. It's going to be in production in 2027. Can't you see us putting those on every military base in the United States? Why wouldn't we do that? They're safe, they're right, and it's a US innovation. It's thrilling. So, I think that those tools are coming. I think we have to embrace them all. But, just building solar and storage to replace everything, could it work? Yeah, but I don't believe we can afford it economically, mostly because of the stranded asset issue that we have.
Okay. Llewellyn?
I would like to point out, and I agree with you, and I think it's very interesting, but I would like to point out that there is a problem in our economics, and that is, and you touched on it, with stranded assets. We have some electric assets that have a life of 100 years, and some that have a life of 20 years. I would imagine a wind turbine is about 20 years. I don't know, maybe making 25 years before it basically would need to be refurbished or rebuilt or replaced. So it's very difficult if you're building, say, a conventional nuclear power plant, even if it's not 1,600 megawatts, if it's 800, that's going to have a design life of 60 years and a possible operating life of 100 years. And if you get the right fuel, you can operate it with very little interruption. We're looking now at fuel not loading every 18 months or maybe loading every 5 years, or I think the X reactor, they say 60 years between the fuel load. That is an incredible economic asset in that you know you will have it for a long, long time and you can plan around it. It gives you a kind of certainty in planning, but it also is at odds with the rest of your system, which is operating on 25-year design life and probably a 25-year finance life. Is that a problem? What do you think about that?
No, I think it's the right investment. We do need to look at the economics, and we need to realize that these assets will be inherited for generations to come. And a great example, TVA and hydro, Hoover Dam. These are 2-cent power today. And I think it's 2.3 cents last I knew, according to EIA.gov. I read that on EIA.gov.
Yeah, it's very cheap.
Very cheap. And what do we do? Well, okay, now I know environmentally, we could never do that today and wouldn't do that today, but we did it already. They're already dammed up. Repowering those assets makes a lot of sense. Repowering wind. Look, wind is built in the wind premium places, natural wind places first. And repowering those 20 years later, sure, absolutely we'll do that. I think they're going to be long-term assets. But if we could put micro modular reactors in that we could bury underground and run for 30 years, dig them up and refuel them, we're going to do that, right? I like
the idea of micro modular reactors. I also think you should use them for maritime purposes. We have huge consumption of diesel in propelling the world's ships. And we started out thinking we would have civilian nuclear ships. There were 2 built. There was the Otterhahn, which the Germans built, and the Savannah, which was the American ship. The plans for it, if you want a small modular reactor, are in Lynchburg. I checked on them. But the idea that we must have nuclear in a much more portable, manageable, and less intimidating form. I think that's very important. And I just concur totally.
I think it's all of the above, and I think there'll be clear winners as time goes by, and maybe micro modular reactors will be displaced by fusion.
We have an incredible 3,000 utilities in the country, and yet they tend to operate in unison. Maybe it was the effect of EPRI itself. When I was around when Chauncey Starr was putting it together, I was very close with Chauncey.
It's the frequency.
Yeah, the frequency. I agree with the frequency, but surprisingly little disparate innovation coming out of the utility industry.
It's true. It's true. And I want to say this very importantly. If we look at what's going on, inserting these batteries at the grid edge changes the whole way the system works for the first time in its existence. Now we're using the grid to charge the batteries that are steady state loads, that are highly predictable, can interact with each other, share and interact in real time with AI running the whole thing on the transmission side. Think of what I'm saying. That's such a beautiful thought, right? Because now we've got all that investment in transmission infrastructure. It's very solid. Let's plug it into the batteries. Let it do its job with the batteries. It'll calm it down. And it'll now enable the system to be hardened, because in the end, everything on the other side of the battery, on the load side, will be handled by inventory of electrons. It's no longer a reactive system. It's now a just-in-time manufacturing plant. The power system is. It's the first time since it was invented that we're able to actually turn it into a just-in-time manufacturing plant versus a reactive system that it is today. So that's such a transformational thought. And I believe that it's going to drive us right into the right place, because when you start looking at the economics, holy cow, the numbers are great. Think of it this way. You look at a diesel genset. I've worked with diesel gensets, pretty good size ones. They optimally run at about 70 to 80%, depending on the manufacturer and the model and the size and all that. But generally 70 to 80%. If you run them at half speed, they're horrible. Their efficiency goes bad and they burn out quite quickly. You have to dial them in. And then they're still terrible. They're 30% efficient, but they're 30% instead of 16% efficient when you dial them in at that sweet spot. Think of what I'm saying. We can dial in our main power plants, even the fossil plants that we have to run for a while, and smooth them out, calm them down. They're going to produce less pollution, and it's going to be far more predictable. And let the batteries be our just-in-time system to deliver the product. For the first time, we can actually deliver electrons. Electrons don't have serial numbers, but we'll know where they are and we'll know when they're available. And we can actually manage the whole thing to the nth degree because we have a new tool to do that. So that's how I think we should harden the grid. And that's how we can cost justify it. The fuel savings alone on that, I don't know the numbers. I don't think anybody does, but I think that's something for Texas State to run a power system model on, because I think the fuel savings of what I just described will pay for a system nationally if we really wanted to make it happen.
I agree.
I think Dan, what we're learning here is that given the nature of the grid, let's call it open innovation. Open innovation. So we talk about how utilities might move at glacier speeds, but on the other hand, we're learning today that we have a new technology that, quote, hardens the grid and makes the grid much more efficient. So open innovation among all industries certainly is the way to go. And of course, the trademark of that is that everybody outside of my company, or there are people outside of my company, there are so many of them that are much smarter than the people inside of my company. So I like the idea of open innovation. I like the idea that the grid, that the utility people have bidded on your technology. And I really like the idea that perhaps we won't have a snowy New England deal in Texas, which we're not accustomed to this year.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, I don't know. I think that Dan had a hard stop. I don't want to keep going. We could talk forever. I appreciate the time, Dan. I leave you with this thought and how I think that a DC grid is the answer. We're going to study it heavily at Texas State. But I'm going to buy an F-150 and I'm going to charge it at free at work, and I'm going to drive it at home and run my house from it. And I'm hoping that the utilities business model is going to keep up with that.
Well, I want to see you not only get it free, I want you to sell power off of that, so you're actually profiting. Because I'm an entrepreneur, so I got to look at ways to make profit, right?
That's right.
But that's great. I love it.
Dan, this has been very insightful, really, actually stimulating and exciting. Thank you very much.
Very much so.
If I may, I will be in touch with you.
Of
Absolutely.
course. I would be honored to have a discussion. By the way, I apologize. I know that we didn't have a chance to sync up after the annual event, Llewellyn, but I would love to spend some time with you one-on-one. And I'll be in the area many times, I'm sure.
We'll do it. We'll do it.
Great.
Johnny, take us away.
Okay. When the evening sun goes down, you will find me hanging around. For the nighttime ain't no good time, but it's my life. Many people just like me, dreaming of old used to be. Oh, the nightlife ain't no good life, but it's my life.
It's a pleasure.
All right.
Take care.
Thank
everyone.
you, gentlemen.
Okay, take care. I'll see everybody.